It is very rare to have something that voters on both sides of the aisle agree on, which is why we got to focus on it when they do. There are calls to ban, limit, or at least change the rules around how Congress invests in stocks. Well, the House committee held a hearing examining potential reforms today, reforms that would directly impact those members of Congress' personal wealth.
It's our hope that this hearing today will bring us closer to developing a consensus on recommended policy reforms that will combat financial conflicts of interest and restore public faith and trust in our government.
We recommend that you require members of Congress to divest conflicting assets with the option to put any remaining assets in a blind trust that is subject to new public disclosures.
The misnomer with respect to qualified blind trust is that it only works if it's truly blind.
It is better to focus on increasing transparency through disclosure.
Disclosure hasn't worked. If anything, disclosure of financial transactions puts it glaringly obvious to the public that the conflicts of interest are there.
Divestment is an option, and it's an option that I think is preferable.
Forced divestment is the option you're talking about, right?
Well, you use force. I would say that being in public service is a choice.
Whatever happens here, we have to keep in mind that every person in this room is an American citizen that has rights and freedoms, and part of that right and freedom is to participate in a free and fair market economy.
It seems like there are more complications than it would seem at first blush.
With us tonight, the man himself, Dave Leventhal, Deputy Washington Bureau Chief for Insider. His extensive reporting on the huge investments and massive conflicts of interest from our members of Congress is part of what sparked these calls for change. Dave, I want you to put this into context for us, because we're not talking about GM stock that members of Congress got for their high school graduation. Explain how massive it has become. 75 different members of Congress suddenly invested in COVID-related stocks just as the pandemic hit. And I'm pretty sure they had a lot more information than you and me.
Well, it's one of the many findings that we had as part of our Conflicted Congress project that published in December. And, we found numerous examples of members of Congress who were engaging in stock trades that, to one extent or another, could conceivably conflict with their public duties as members of Congress. So you mentioned pandemic-related stocks such as Moderna, Johnson & Johnson. Obviously, Pfizer was a big one that was invested in by members of Congress, but also makers of tests, makers of PPE. And then the list goes on with all different sorts of oil investments, energy investments. You kind of name it, members of Congress invest in it, and it raises the questions that you just played out a moment ago.
But those who oppose change, we heard it right there, are making this argument. We've heard it from Nancy Pelosi. This is a free market system. This is capitalism. They're private citizens. They should be able to invest. But they get a different deal than everybody else. Shouldn't they be held to the same standards at, let's say, federal workers, journalists, the financial sector? I mean, officers at publicly traded companies have huge restrictions on what they can do. So isn't it disingenuous for members of Congress to say, why should we be treated differently? They're treated differently now.
And members of Congress, they are different. So people who are advocating for changes to the rules as they exist today, they're making the point that, hey, look, members of Congress, they have inside information that they get, non-public information, by virtue of them being members of Congress. They're also lobbied to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars a year by the very companies that members of Congress invest in. So you put that together and you've got a situation that is very different up on Capitol Hill relative to what you or me or just anyone hanging out at home with their stock trade app is doing. Now, the countervailing argument is, look, members of Congress should be able to participate in the economy. They come into Congress and then they leave. They shouldn't be treated differently. But I think what we saw from the hearing today is that that opinion is in the minority. There are many members of Congress who want to do something about this. The big question right now is, how big are they going to go? Are they going to do something really dramatic, like ban members of Congress from trading stocks? Or are they going to do something more around the margins and periphery, which is definitely a possibility at this point, too?
Well, it's noisy. You made it noisy because you alerted so many people to it. But what's the actual likelihood that we're going to see change? We are calling upon Congress to regulate themselves, to limit their own abilities to make a lot of money that they've been making.
Yeah, Congress makes the rules for Congress. So it's not as if some outside organization is going to put the rules in place for lawmakers. You're going to have to effectively have lawmakers and rely on them to do it themselves. So as a result, you're getting these arguments within Congress as to how hard they do want to be on themselves. The Democrats right now, of course, are in the majority in both the House and the Senate. They're leading the charge here. There are some Republicans who have already co-sponsored bills, are definitely out front in trying to advocate for this. Even Kevin McCarthy, the minority leader for the Republicans in the House, has said, hey, I'm very open to doing something like this, too. But we got a very strong sense from lawmakers today after this hearing that the clock is ticking. I mean, we're almost into the fourth quarter of the legislative session. We've got elections coming up in November. So the window of opportunity here, if Congress is going to do something, is closing. And it's already pretty narrow as it is right now. So they got to do something quick.
Well, everybody talks a big game when the cameras are on and our microphones are in their face. But when it comes time to vote, that could be a very different story.